Well, hello everybody. Welcome again to my backyard. We don't have very many great fall days like this left, so we have to take advantage of every opportunity to be outside, including even filming these video clips. So I have a lot of information I'm going to be giving you today and for the next few of the video clips on an incredible book that I read called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And I really thought I was almost beyond getting angry about, angrier I should say, about some of the shortcomings in healthcare after I read Peter Gacci's book on mammography. But I have to say this one's actually made me angrier than the Gacci book. So the name of the book is Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's by Robert Whitaker, and it deals with the issue of the appropriateness of using psychiatric drugs ranging from antidepressants to drugs for ADHD to drugs like Risperdal for schizophrenia, and whether or not these drugs are actually useful. And I always, when I cover books, it would be easy to just give a real quick summary and hope that I interest people in reading the book, but I always assume that a lot of people won't read the book, so I'll try and provide you as much information as possible, maybe bordering on overkill, but I think it's pretty interesting. And I'll start with a quote that was included in the book that I think just really sets the stage for the information. It says, quote, "I would like to point out that in the history of medicine there are many examples of situations where the vast majority of physicians did something that turned out to be wrong. The best example is bloodletting, which was the most common medical practice from the 1st century AD until the 19th century. And so the bottom line is that there's an assumption that if a practice is widespread, it must be okay. I mean, there must be some evidence to support it, or how could it have become widespread, right? Well, that's not always the case. Okay, so I'll start at the beginning. Robert Whitaker, who is he? He's a former newspaper reporter who left reporting to start a publishing company called CenterWatch. And what this company did was report on clinical trials for drugs. At the time, his belief was that drugs in general were useful. Drug companies were doing useful work and that their products improved medical treatment. He became particularly interested in the efficacy of psychiatric drugs when he stumbled upon some research from Harvard showing that since 1994, outcomes for schizophrenics in the United States had gotten a whole lot worse, and also some research from the World Health Organization showing that the outcomes for schizophrenics were much better in other countries, poorer countries like Nigeria, where only a few patients take the drugs, than in the United States, where they were commonly prescribed. So Whitaker emphasizes in the foreword to the book that he formerly believed that psychiatric drugs were for the mentally ill what insulin was to diabetics. It was necessary, it was helpful, until the evidence just took him elsewhere. Now, to give an idea of the problem and how it's developed over the last several years, mental illness causes 850 adults and 250 children to be labeled as disabled every single day. You heard that right, every day. The numbers are actually bigger than that because these numbers only represent those families who get disability checks from the government due to disability. So we know that there are plenty of people who become disabled who aren't getting some form of government assistance, even though they're labeled disabled because they're mentally ill. In 2007, the United States spent $25 billion on psychiatric drugs, more than the gross domestic product of Cameroon, a nation of 18 million people. Now, this is an incredible investment, and you could justify it if the outcomes were really excellent, but the data tells us a little bit of a different story. So the book actually begins, the important parts of the book begin with comparative data on mental illness in the United States. And I'm using notes because there are a lot of numbers here, and I think it's important to get this right. In 1955, there were 566,000 people in state and county mental institutions. 355,000 of those people had a psychiatric diagnosis. Now, it was common to put people in institutions because they were mentally retarded or they had Alzheimer's or another diagnosis back in those days. So that's why you see a differential in the number. And in 1955, 1 in 468 people in the United States was hospitalized for mental illness. Those were the statistics. Now, in 1987, a very interesting thing happened. That was when the FDA approved Prozac. And within 20 years, the ranks of the disabled due to mental illness grew to 3.97 million people. That's a pretty big jump. So in 2007, the disability rate was 1 in 76. And remember, in 1955, it was 1 in 468. This is 6 times the number of people that were previously disabled. But even more important, in 1955, fewer people were disabled from bipolar and severe depression. only 50,937 people. Today, there are 1.4 million people disabled from these conditions, and the numbers are still growing. And the General Accounting Office reports that 46% of adults age 18 to 26 who are getting a disability check have been diagnosed with an affective illness, and another 8% with an anxiety disorder. What's really frightening, and I've talked about this many times with children, the growing disease rate in young children, but it also pertains to mental health. In 1987, there were 16,200 children under the age of 18 getting SSI payments, or disability payments for mental illness. It was about 5.5% of the children getting SSI at that point in time. By 2007, the numbers had ballooned to 561,569 children, representing half of the children who were getting disability payments for the government. In fact, the leading reason for qualifying for disability payments. And during this same period of time, what's equally interesting to me anyway, is that the number of children who were qualifying for disability based on other conditions was actually going down. So I think it's an appropriate question to ask, how do you reconcile these types of outcomes with $25 billion being spent on these drugs? If the drugs really worked, shouldn't the number of sick and disabled people be going down instead of up? Well, Whitaker includes some information about the history of mental illness. If you want to really understand what happened here, you have to go back to almost the beginning. In 1844, asylums provided a form of what was called moral therapy that the Quakers developed. And at that time, more than 50% of patients who were committed to an asylum actually went home, and most never came back or required more treatment. In other words, they had some type of mental illness or emotional illness or even a psychotic break. They recovered, they went home, they resumed their lives, and everything was fine. But in the late 1800s, things changed a little bit because people who were senile and patients with syphilis and mental retardation were also being remanded into mental institutions, and these people had no chance of recovery, regardless of what you did for them. And so the common knowledge at the time, and we all know what I think of common knowledge, it's often not knowledge at all, but it was thought that moral therapy was a failure because so many people were remaining institutionalized. Of course, there was no differentiation at that time between Alzheimer's and depression. So in 1892, things changed a bit. Asylum superintendents, they were called, decided to use physical treatments like injections of sheep thyroid and horse serum and arsenic. One doctor even removed all of his patients' teeth and said that that led to a better outcome. They were literally experimenting on humans in the mental institutions, which should have bothered somebody, but you know, the internet and other forms of communication didn't make this kind of thing really widely known at the time. In the 1930s and 40s, psychiatrists began using therapies that acted on the brain, such as high doses of insulin that would induce a coma, followed by glucose to bring them back to life, which supposedly would rewire their brain circuitry. It may sound like a crazy idea now, but remember, bloodletting went on for hundreds of years. Convulsive therapies like electroshock were introduced, and then even frontal lobotomy was introduced, which seems like a pretty drastic solution to mental illness. There was no evidence to support these practices, but that didn't stop the psychiatric profession from conducting what amounted to experiments on humans as if they were experimental animals. Not that I would think this was any better if it was done with animals. Well, while this was all going on, some people started getting curious about what went on in mental institutions, and some reporters actually visited mental institutions and did exposés on what was going on. And the pictures showed naked men huddling in corners, people strapped to beds and essentially being warehoused in facilities. And one author compared it to the Nazi concentration camps, and it became apparent that a different approach was needed. In fact, there was a great public outcry at the time that something different needed to be done. At the same time, psychiatrists were screening people for suitability to be drafted into the military, and at that time, 1.75 million men who were identified as mentally unfit could not enter the military. And this drew a lot of attention to mental illness in a different sort of way, that maybe we needed to make it more of a priority to treat mental illness and to expand services. The problem was the approach, which was to make existing treatments, which, just based on the descriptions I've given you, marginal would almost be a kind word, useless maybe would be better. There was just a push to make those treatments available to more people. At the same time, there was the hope among psychiatrists that at some point in time they would practice like real doctors, which meant that they would examine patients and at some point in time prescribe drugs. That idea really started to develop as sort of a wish or desire among psychiatrists even back then. In 1946, the National Mental Health Act was passed, which would provide for government-sponsored research. And of course, again, the problem was that the research and the research was focused on practices for which there was no hope of ever making anybody well. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll be picking this up in my Thursday broadcast. But one thing I'll remind everybody is that we're focusing on this issue at our fall conference, and we've invited Dr. Peter Breggin, who is one of the psychiatrists who, at a very early point in the development of the drug business, and it is a business, started speaking out about these issues. He's authored 20 books on the topic. He is the country's authority, and he'll be speaking on this topic at our conference, as well as Dr. Walter Jacobson, the medical director of our emotional wellness program. So plan to spend November 2nd through 4th in Columbus with us, because you'll really get some information that will be incredibly interesting about this topic. So as always, please pass this on to anybody who you think might be interested in getting this type of information. And we'll have the second installment on this very interesting book by Robert Whitaker called Anatomy of an Epidemic when I come back to you on Thursday.